Cradle of Horror presents The Dentist. Going to the dentist can be, at least for some, an uncomfortable experience. But going to this particular dentist is more akin to a horror story. The legend starts in the 1800s, and it begins with a carpenter working for a dentist. But it doesn't end there. The carpenter was hired by the dentist to build a shed on the dentist's property. One day, the dentist told the carpenter he'd be away most of the day for work and would only be back late that night. If the carpenter had any questions, he could ask the dentist's wife, who would be in the main house with her child all day. The carpenter was consumed by his work, as he wanted to complete it on time. He was so focused that he almost didn't notice smoke coming from the main house. At first, the smoke was just a light drip of gray slowly floating from the roof. And then suddenly, it was like someone opened the floodgates, and the drip became a waterfall of black haze. When the dentist came home that night, he was greeted by the carpenter, slumped down in front of a pile of ashes and wood. They were the house's remains. In his arms was the dentist's wife, and in the dentist's wife's arms was his child. The carpenter explained that he did everything he could to save the dentist's wife and child, but he couldn't get to them in time. The wife's lifeless body was severely burnt, and the child was barely recognizable. In his rage, the dentist believed the carpenter did it on purpose. Despite the carpenter's protests, the dentist didn't believe him. The only item to survive the fire was the bell that was attached to the child's bassinet. It sat in the middle of the disaster, ringing in the wind. Being the only dentist in town had its advantages. Anyone who needed a dentist would come and see him, so the dentist decided to bide his time. He figured that one day, the carpenter might walk into his office, and when he did, the dentist would be ready. The dentist's staff was told that if the carpenter came for an appointment, they were to ring a bell to alert the dentist to his presence. The dentist placed his late child's bell right in the middle of the front desk. The staff didn't know why, but the dentist did not want to be caught off guard. The dentist waited almost 6 months before that special bell rang. However, it wasn't the carpenter, but the carpenter's son who walked in. It angered the dentist to see the carpenter's son, who was allowed to walk around the earth when his own child would never have that chance. When the carpenter's son sat down in his chair, the dentist was ready for his revenge. The dentist pulled out every single tooth the carpenter's son had. The carpenter's son wailed in pain and screamed for the dentist to stop. But the dentist was in a rage. By the time the dentist pulled out the last tooth, the carpenter's son was passed out in the chair. The pain became too intense. He couldn't sustain it. Everyone at the dentist's office was frightened by the dentist's behavior, and no one knew what to do. So, they left the carpenter's son to sleep off the pain. It seemed like he might be out for the rest of the day. But as the dentist left his office, he rang the special bell to celebrate his accomplishment. The bell woke up the carpenter's son, who immediately remembered the events of the afternoon. The carpenter's son was in pain, but it wasn't until he reached his hand up to his mouth that he realized the extent of the situation. The horror set in when he looked in the mirror and saw his toothless mouth looking back at him. Everyone in town took pity on him. He had a hard time speaking and eating, and even though the carpenter made him wooden teeth, they never worked properly. The carpenter's son eventually stopped eating, and he withered away until he died. The carpenter was destroyed by his son's passing, but he tried to continue living for his wife and other children. The whole town knew what happened, and they all felt sympathy for the carpenter and his son. But they couldn't stop going to this dentist, as there was no other dentist in town. The dentist, on the other hand, never did again what he did to the carpenter's son that day, but everyone was afraid of him. Even though the dentist's office had a bell on the door that was different from the special bell, over time, the two became conflated. Everyone believed that when the bell on the door rang, it meant the dentist had an evil plan for them. So much paranoia surrounded the dentist's office that if anyone fell ill or died after any type of contact with the dentist, they believed it was because he did something to them. They believed that he had a vendetta against anyone who was happy or had a family. He became known as the killer dentist, even though he didn't actually kill anyone. The legend stayed around because the dentist's nephew became a dentist himself, and he took over his uncle's practice. The same rumors followed him, and whenever anyone in town heard a bell ring, they became fearful. Centuries went by, and the little dentist's office grew and modernized, but it stayed in the same location. The stories became bigger and more dramatic, and a certain subsect of the population in the area still believed that the dentist's spirit was there. They thought that his spirit was somehow involved in causing pain to happy couples and families. That subsect would purposely schedule appointments around Halloween. They would share their experiences online with the rest of the community, and they would detail what they saw. That's why a married couple named Jenny and Robert went to this particular dentist in 2025. They went for the sole purpose of seeing if the stories were true. Robert didn't believe any of them, but Jenny believed every single word she heard. Jenny and Robert walked into the office, and the bell that went off as they entered made Jenny jump. Robert scoffed. They had their appointments in separate rooms, so Jenny made a face to Robert as though they may never see each other again, but Robert rolled his eyes. Jenny was ready to investigate. She looked for anything that could be out of place, anything that may remind her of the story. She was pretty disappointed because her experience was fairly bland and uneventful, aside from the bell at the door. She even told the dental hygienist as she was about to leave that she'd hoped it would be a little bit more exciting. The dental hygienist responded that the stories weren't true, but that the dentist's office benefits financially from the amount of people who come for checkups only because of the urban legend. When Robert met Jenny in the lobby, she raised her arms in defeat and laughed at herself. She admitted that it was just like any old dentist's office. Robert just scoffed again. Although, on the drive home, Robert was strikingly silent. Jenny kept telling him he could say, "I told you so," but he didn't seem to want to. Jenny kept coaxing him and ribbing him. but he wouldn't say anything. That night, Jenny fell asleep quickly before Robert even came to bed. She woke up to hear screaming from the washroom. She then heard something fall. She was certain it was Robert. She ran to the washroom to see Robert on the floor, surrounded by blood. He had pliers clamped onto his tooth, with several other teeth on the floor. He screamed at Jenny to get them out. He wanted her to help him pull out his teeth. Jenny didn't want to, and she tried to grab the pliers. Robert kept dodging her grip, and he pushed her out of the washroom as soon as he realized that she wasn't going to help him. Jenny called 911, and she tried to break down the door while she waited. The whole time, she could hear Robert ripping out his teeth. Whenever another one would drop to the floor, she heard a light ding sound, like a bell. She counted 13 teeth before the EMTs were able to break down the door. The EMTs restrained Robert, who continued to scream to help him take out his teeth. As they took Robert away on a stretcher, Jenny looked into the washroom to find the floor covered in teeth and blood. Robert was held overnight, and they gave him something to calm him down. He never recovered, though. For the rest of his life, he continued to take medication that left him withdrawn. He never really spoke again. He would only mumble about needing to take his teeth out. Jenny looked after him until he stopped eating and withered away until he died. Jenny never returned to that particular dentist's office, or any dentist's office, ever again. She was too afraid of what might happen. Years after Robert's death, she developed a cavity, one that she never treated. It slowly spread throughout her mouth, causing an infection that she never looked after. And then she passed away when the infection became too severe. Before she died, Jenny heard a bell ring that no one else heard. She knew the dentist had finally come for her.